Hey, it's Brian Winter. If you love the America's Quarterly podcast, please consider becoming a member of our parent organization, America's Society. For 60 years, America's Society has been the House of Latin America in New York. We're a not-for-profit organization that depends on members like you to keep this podcast going. Your membership will help support our work, and it will also give you special access to in-person events in New York City, virtual programs for members outside of New York, and 4 print issues a year of America's Quarterly. All of that for as little as $70 a year. Learn more on our website at as-coa.org. That's as-coa.org.
Welcome to the America's Quarterly podcast. I'm Luisa Franco, in for Brian Winter. In Brazil, a landmark trial is unfolding, that of former President and Donald Trump ally Jair Bolsonaro. How are Brazilian authorities bracing for potential reactions from the United States?
I've been talking a lot with people in the presidential palace and also Itamaraty, and they view everything that President Trump is doing as effectively an attempt at regime change. So they don't think this is going to stop after Bolsonaro's trial. This is going to go into next year when we have presidential elections. The Brazilian government is already planning what to do next year because they're going to keep on trying to influence, this time, to help whatever candidate is the heir of Bolsonaro's voters. Before that, there is also certainty, I can say, that there's going to be further retaliation from the U.S. once the verdict is public.
Brazil's former President Jair Bolsonaro and 7 other military members and former ministers stand accused of plotting to overturn the results of the 2022 election. The trial, which began this Tuesday and is expected to end next week, will determine Brazil's political future as the country nears elections in 2026. And it'll reverberate well beyond its borders. U.S. President Donald Trump is certainly watching. In the past months, the U.S. has launched a campaign against Brazil's judiciary and government in favor of Bolsonaro, who's a Trump ally. The trial could potentially be historic also because it represents a break with the past. Although Brazil has faced a number of coup attempts, never before has a high-ranking official stood trial for undermining democracy. Today on the podcast, we'll get a behind-the-scenes view of the case. We'll ask why a conviction seems all but certain, analyze the international tension swirling around the trial, and understand how the Brazilian political scenario is being reshaped, how the right is trying to reorient itself in Bolsonaro's likely absence, and how, on the other side of politics, President Lula's camp is reacting. Our guest is Patricia Campos Mello, a reporter for Folha de São Paulo. No one covers international relations and politics quite like her in Brazil. Patricia, welcome back to the AQ podcast.
Thank you, Luisa. Thank you for having me.
Patricia, you've been covering the trial live for your newspaper, Folha de São Paulo. What's been the tone so far?
The first day, we had Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who is responsible for the case, the rapporteur, so to say. Actually, he started the session at the Supreme Court speaking, it's like a speech full of messages, right? I mean, it is historical because you are trying a former president who attempted a coup and all other military leaders who were implicated. And as you said, in a country that has been through so many coup attempts before. But it is also historic because you have a foreign power trying to interfere in the judiciary. And I think Alexandre de Moraes made that very clear. People who have been criticizing the trial or the judge say that it's been politicized, that, justice has been weaponized. So the other thing that he's also trying to convey is that this is a fair trial, investigation was fair, people had access to defense, all that. So I think in that sense, it started full of messages for the domestic and foreign audiences. I guess so many people are watching, right? I mean, it might be as the magazine Economist said, might be a way to teach other countries how to recover from the populist fever. There's very little doubt that Bolsonaro is going to be convicted. The big question is, what kind of sentence is he going to get? And if the Supreme Court is going to do this in a way that tries to assuage all these concerns that this is a politicized trial. So this is very important that the Supreme Court shows, that it really went through the evidence and it did try to do a very a fair trial.
We should say that former President Bolsonaro denies any wrongdoing and that his defense team argues that anything other than an acquittal would be a miscarriage of justice. But there doesn't seem to be anyone who raises the possibility that Bolsonaro could be acquitted, right? Why is the conviction considered such a certainty, and what's the evidence against him?
Sure. One of the reasons is exactly because there's so much evidence in this case. I mean, one of the things, you have drafts of memoranda that were actually laying out plans to have a martial law in Brazil or something that is called state of defense. And you have communications showing that then President Bolsonaro was aware of that. He actually edited this memo, with instructions of, and this included, arresting the head of the electoral court, back then was Alexandre de Moraes, and arresting other government officials. And on top of that, on top of having all this communication among several of Bolsonaro's ministers and aides, Bolsonaro himself, when he was interrogated a few months ago, he admitted that he tried to find alternatives after they tried to dispute the election results in the electoral courts. The electoral court said, there was no fraud. There's no widespread fraud. So he admitted before the Supreme Court, he said, we were just looking into alternatives, but they were all constitutional alternatives, except they were not, because basically what they were trying is to, have a martial law, and martial law is only used when you have, a foreign enemy invading the country or something that is very, very serious. So if you have these two things, like thousands, millions of pages of evidence, communication, cell phone logs, plus Bolsonaro admitting that he was actually considering an alternative to remain in power, it's really hard not to have a conviction.
So as we were saying earlier, this trial is happening at the same time that the U.S. is trying to pressure the Brazilian judiciary to favor Bolsonaro. They are sanctioning Justice Moraes. They've revoked visas for other justices and ministers, and they've imposed one of the highest tariffs in the world of 50%. At the start of the trial on Tuesday, we saw Justice Moraes, who's the justice who's really at the center of this trial and is Trump's main target, open the proceedings with indirect but not exactly veiled references to Trump's attempts to intervene in the Brazilian judiciary and politics. He said that the defense of national sovereignty is part of the Republican duty of the court. How do you evaluate the impact of the dispute between Brazil and the U.S. on the trial?
I think one thing we can't forget is how unprecedented this is. Having a country telling another country, you cannot sentence, a former president, like trying to interfere with the judiciary. This is really unprecedented. And so far, I can say that President Trump's attempt to help his ideological friend, President Bolsonaro, has backfired because it only strengthened the resolve of the Supreme Court. Now it's a matter of sovereignty. It became a matter of national sovereignty, defending Brazil's sovereignty. So far, I mean, I don't think there was ever any room for, maneuvering or not getting a conviction. But with all those attempts and threats and pressure, it just made it, really a priority to guarantee the independence of the judiciary.
And in the opposite direction, you have a lot of sources in government and in Brazil's foreign service. What are these authorities bracing for in terms of potential retaliations from the U.S.?
Absolutely. I've been talking a lot with people in Planalto, with the presidential palace, and also Itamaraty. And they view everything that is happening with the US government, everything that President Trump is doing, as effectively an attempt at regime change. So they don't think this is going to stop after Bolsonaro's trial. This is going to go into next year when we have presidential elections. And probably, very probably, former President Bolsonaro will not be able to run. But still, the Brazilian government is already, planning what to do next year, because they're going to keep on trying to influence this time, to help whatever candidate is the heir of Bolsonaro's voters. Before that, there is also certainty, I can say, that there's going to be further retaliation from the US once the verdict is public. So what they are planning for and expecting, one of the most probable things I think that's going to happen is that more Supreme Court justices are going to be targeted with the Magnitsky Act sanctions. So besides Justice Alexandre de Moraes, and also they will apply the Magnitsky Act in a stricter way. The Brazilian government expects further pressure on the banks, mainly Banco do Brasil, which is the bank that pays the salaries of all the government officials. And there might be some sanctions on Banco do Brasil. That is a possibility that the Planalto and Itamaraty are counting on. More Magnitsky Act sanctions on justices, and more visas are going to be revoked. We had the Minister of Justice, Lewandowski, lost his visa to the US, the Minister of Health for different reason, but he did. And of course, then Alexandre de Moraes and several of the Supreme Court justices. So that wouldn't be like a huge escalation or surprise. They're already counting on that. If Trump decides to really, do something worse, he could, for instance, eliminate the exceptions. There were 700 products that were under exceptions for the 50% tariffs that were imposed on Brazil using the Emergency Powers Act. So this is something that would be really, really bad for the Brazilian economy. And that's something that they don't think it's going to happen now. They think it's a worst case scenario.
So let's look at what all of this means for the country's future and for elections in 2026. How is Bolsonaro's camp dealing with the trial, and what are the political implications for the Brazilian right more broadly?
At this precise moment, I think there's a fracture in the right in Brazil, because there's a contest who's going to be the heir of Bolsonaro's votes. He has a huge voter base, almost, if you think about last presidential elections, it was very close, like a 2 percentage point difference between Lula and Bolsonaro, and he still keeps a lot of support. So any candidate in the right needs Bolsonaro's support. The dream candidate for businessmen, for the center, would be Tarcísio, who is the governor of São Paulo. He is considered by some, he's viewed as a more moderate voice. However, he needs Bolsonaro's support, even though he seems like a technocrat, right? Like a guy who's very technical, and he was a minister. He has this aura of being very efficient. He has to make gestures towards the more radical wing of Bolsonarism. And he does do that because he has to. And right now, he is 100% committed to trying to get an amnesty legislation approved in Congress to save Bolsonaro or whoever. Why is this going to happen? There's a dispute, a contest between Bolsonaro's sons, basically Eduardo Bolsonaro, a legislator who is now living in the US, and the Centrão, which is the pork barrel caucus, so to say. They're fueled by pork barrel. They're interested in that. And they would like to have Tarcísio, who is seen as less extremist, less of a radical than Eduardo. The sons have been putting pressure on the father, saying, there's no guarantee that if Tarcísio is the candidate, he's going to give you a pardon, or he's going to fight for amnesty or something. So now Tarcísio is like 100% committed to convince the Bolsonaro family that, yes, he's so loyal and he's going to try to get an amnesty legislation approved. So he's not going to step down until he knows if Bolsonaro really supports him. On the other hand, Bolsonaro and his family, they want to keep this political capital as long as possible. So he's not going to endorse a candidate or say, yes, this is the guy, this is my heir, he's going to he has my full support. He's going to extend this, delay this decision. And this is making, center-right politicians and right-wing politicians really go nuts.
You portray this move by Tarcísio, the São Paulo governor, to push for an amnesty as something he's doing to further his campaign objectives, right? What's the likelihood of such a pardon from Congress? I mean, what do they get from it, given that polls show that most Brazilians are against such an amnesty? And how would it affect Bolsonaro's fate?
According to recent polling by Datafolha, 55% of Brazilians do not support this amnesty bill that would basically annul or eliminate the convictions related to the January 8th attacks in Brasilia. So it is unpopular. But the Supreme Court has really been annoying deputies, the legislators, because it's been investigating pork barrel scheme that implicates like half the Congress, like so many legislators. So they want to get back at the Supreme Court. So approving amnesty would basically be a gesture of, whatever you guys at the judiciary branch do, you just convicted President Bolsonaro, but we're just going to do away with this. So it would be a reaction. And now it's getting more and more difficult for the Speaker of the House not to vote. Now, the big question is, would that be a pardon for the hundreds of people who were involved in, the looting of Brasilia's government buildings? Or would it also be a pardon to Bolsonaro and the other government officials? There is a likelihood. It was very, very small. Now it's getting more and more likely that this amnesty bill is going to be voted on. There is a big possibility of it getting approved because, as I was saying, so many legislators hate the Supreme Court that is investigating them for pork barrel. But if it is voted, there is pressure from the other side, including the Senate, to have a bill that would not include Bolsonaro and his main allies, would only include, smaller fish. From a point of view of someone who's not in Brazil, and I think they say this phrase, Brazil is not for beginners. Like, you have the Supreme Court trying the former president, and at the same time, Congress starts to discuss, and maybe it's going to vote a bill that simply just disregards anything the Supreme Court just decided. So it's just crazy.
Given this scenario and the fact that Tarcísio has said that he will pardon Bolsonaro if he's elected, how do you see Brazil's vulnerability to further challenges to democracy moving ahead? If these convictions happen, will the country be protected from further coup attempts?
I think it could be a game changer because it's going to be the first time this legislation is used. It replaced the former national security legislation, which was something from the military dictatorship. And so they have this new legislation since 2021 that is the Bill of Rule of Law of Democratic State. If they actually use this legislation for the first time and they convict a former president of trying to disrupt democracy, it is historical. And even if Congress approves a bill that basically, cancels the verdict of the Supreme Court is going to overrule that, to annul that legislation because it's not going to be constitutional. So whatever happens, the fact that a former president is finally, and also all the several military chiefs are held accountable, it is really a lesson to be learned by all of us. I don't think it works as a vaccine. I don't think it prevents or actually it saves us from future coup attempts. But it is a really good thing against, so to say, moral hazard, because people are so sure of impunity here and in so many places that actually saying, there is legislation, the piece of legislation is being used, and no matter what, if you're the president or the son of the president or whoever, you're going to be held accountable. This makes a difference.
So let's look at the other side of politics. President Lula, who will most likely face one of those right-wing candidates next year. How is the Lula camp positioning itself? What's been their strategy?
Of course, when the Supreme Court justices were targeted with the visa bans and when Justice Alexandre de Moraes was sanctioned by the US government, President Lula, showed solidarity in public and said stuff, but they're not being overly enthusiastic. You see, of course, the leader of the government caucus in Congress, saying, this is very good that President Bolsonaro is going to finally be held accountable, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think they're trying not to overplay it, because that feeds into this narrative that's politicized trial, that justice is being weaponized. So we're not seeing President Lula like talking about this all the time. He's saying, we have democracy, so everybody is considered innocent until proven guilty, and this is what has to happen. It's tricky. It's very sensitive to have this balance. Otherwise, it just feeds or fuels this narrative that, this is weaponization of justice.
And how about beyond the trial, in the dispute with the U.S. more broadly? How do you see Brazil playing it?
They're celebrating. The Lula government was in a very bad position in the beginning of the year, very low approval rating, a lot of difficulties to get stuff approved. And then you get the foreign enemy, rally around the flag. And it's not being like a huge bump in the polls, but there is a gradual increase in the approval rating of Lula. With this, they finally found a political message to unite voters. There were no political program, actually, like social services or cash transfer programs or anything that were going to get votes. And now they think they found something. So they're basically celebrating.
I'd like to make the most of your knowledge of international relations, having covered it so well for so long. What do you think this trial means for Brazil's standing on the international stage?
Well, I think the trial and the back and forth with President Trump, it's actually a really welcome distraction for the Lula administration. But in a more general way, I think it strengthens this administration's, Lula's administration's position of, you need to strengthen the global South alliances. This whole, the rhetoric, that you can't trust the US and you need to ally yourself with China and Russia, which that strategy, of course, has so many dangers. You're reducing your dependence on the US to increase your dependence on China. Not very healthy. But still, it all is really positive. It just agrees with the narrative of this administration that has a little bit of a Cold War mentality still. And in that sense, everything that President Trump is doing shows, the U.S. is not, you can't trust the U.S. So we need to strengthen our alliances with the Global South partners, with BRICS and all that. So it's sort of a vindication of the Lulista foreign policy. I spoke with some government officials in Planalto, in Itamaraty, and they were really happy because two economics Nobel Prize winners, Paul Krugman and Joe Stiglitz, and Steve Levitsky, the political scientist, Harvard political scientist, they were really enthusiastically supporting Brazil's stance vis-a-vis the U.S. and the way they were resisting U.S. pressures and the way they were, trying to have a fair trial and keep the three branches of the government independent. So in that sense, they see it as a political gain for Brazil up until now. I'm not sure what's going to happen in the future, if the tariffs are going to cause, economic losses, and then we're going to see this in inflation, blah, blah, blah. But as of now, in their view, the fact that you have international thinkers, opinion makers, supporting Brazil's courageous stance towards Trump and the pressure of the extreme right. There was a column recently by a Portuguese professor, Rui Tavares, saying, in Hungary, people just watched when the institutions were being demolished. They were just like, okay, so we're not going to do anything, or we're not going to hold these people responsible because they might end up being martyrs. And in other places, and in Brazil, it's the first time they're actually going to prosecute extreme right-wing leader. they're not afraid he's going to be turned into a martyr, or if he is, whatever, you need to keep the justice. So it's a different thing. It's a different reaction to the populist, extreme right-wing wave, and we'll see what's going to happen.
Patricia, thank you so much for joining us on the AQ podcast again. It's always wonderful to have you. We hope to have you back on soon.
Thank you so much, Luisa. That's a huge honor. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.